thresholds, regulations, and technology. My name is David Paxton. I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Risk Officer at Bankers Bank, and I'm also a Certified Community Bank Risk Specialist and your host for today's session. This program is brought to you by Bankers Bank, the Midwest's leading provider of correspondent banking services to community banks as an independent source for non-competing financial institutions. Bankers Bank provides serves a market of over 600 financial institutions and provides a strong portfolio of innovative products and services to help our community banks thrive and focus their needs on their customers and their communities. A couple of housekeeping items for today. First is that everyone's muted. So if you have any questions, submit those via the chat feature. And Josh and Elliot actually will answer questions as many as they can during the presentation if you submit them via chat. So we'll try to answer those real time. It'll be a little bit different for us today. Josh and Elliot, I'll let them introduce themselves here in a moment, but they're from Plant Moran with years of experience, and they have agreed to provide some information today on the future of what to expect under the auditor's perspective. And again, submit your questions via chat as we go, but I will go ahead and turn it over to Josh and Elliot.
That is great. Thank you. Let me grab the screen here. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. Let me know when that shows up. All right. Up there. We're moving. So like you mentioned, in today's session, I hope, as he mentioned before, is a chance for us to share some background and insights, primarily from an auditor's perspective. Both Elliot and I are in the assurance group here at Plant Moran. I'm a partner. He's a senior manager. We work with financial institutions exclusively, both on external audits and internal audits. I think that gives us a unique perspective. This year in particular, we've got quite a few things in the works. Oh, someone just said there's a blank screen. Apologies. Anyway, so with that background, we'll share our insights on what we know and sort of in the context of a unique year that had a lot of different changes that, our industry sees a lot of changes, but this year it's changes that kind of have a little bit more of an impact with respect to our sort of audit planning. So if nothing else, practically speaking, we'd like to sort of give you all a little bit of background on what we think those major implications are, major changes are this year. And hopefully, as you're in the middle of the year, you might have your audit plans still in process and you're sort of thinking through, what am I going to do with my year-end audit? Hopefully we can share some background there. You've probably got some internal audits, other risk management services that kicked off already. Again, our goal is to share some perspective on things just to keep in mind relative to the changing environment. So hopefully, I see we haven't scared everyone off with the topic, discussing audits in general. But Elliot, why does this matter for our audience? Why does this matter for people that aren't auditors or people that aren't actively engaged in sort of doing the actual audits themselves?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question to sort of set the stage for our discussion today. When you have a topic like this, when an audit and risk management planning, very easy to see the direct relevance to the individuals in your risk department or the individuals in your internal audit department, those that are primarily tasked with developing your risk assessments and with interacting or coordinating with your auditors or third-party service providers. But if we think about that concept of the three lines of defense, you've got risk and audit are your second and third lines, but the first line of the business line managers is also a really critical piece of this to developing an effective audit and risk management plan. These are the individuals that really have those day-to-day experiences, experiencing the changes in your operation, the changes in your risk, seeing how that impacts your processes, your employees, how customers react. So they really have a lot of that knowledge that is important to be communicated to those that sit in the risk and in internal audit spots to make sure that you are developing an appropriate plan to mitigate those risks. Then on the flip side of that, if we think about those in more of a oversight position, so if you're more in the senior management or board level, you're heavily reliant on the communication between those lines and ultimately the reporting of those functions to make sure that you're informed and have the ability to sort of effectively challenge what you've established as your risk management plan for the year. So important to stay informed and know the right kind of questions to be asking to make sure that process is best designed. So really everybody in the organization has an important role to play. And then I think
exactly. Bottom line is, outside of the auditors, I think we all have an important role, and hopefully some of this knowledge will translate to everybody that's on the call today.
Yeah, that is definitely the hope. And this slide here gives sort of just an overview of the high level topics that we'll discuss in more detail as we go through today. I think if you were to look at the context in the boxes here, pretty clear grouping of sort of two primary concepts that we'll talk about, which will be regulatory changes and then also just the continual and ever more rapidly changing technology environment, our use of technology. But really, the bigger purpose of this slide currently is just to show you kind of the volume of changes we've experienced recently here over the past year. I think this is a little bit unique to maybe what we typically experience in the industry, where it might be appropriate to kind of run that, we call it SALI, same as last year, run the same kind of approach to our risk assessments and our risk management plan, especially in a year like this with the volume of changes. Just even more important to make sure you really are thinking about those changes. How do those changes impact the risks that you see with your organization, and what do we have to do to respond to those risks, and ultimately what's the audit plan that we need in place in order to monitor that we are abiding by those controls that we've established. And then with that, I guess also important to understand that as you develop that audit plan, there are various users of those different audits. So we start here with regulators and examiners. Their focus in these audits, the focus of each of these individuals is going to relate to sort of their responsibility, what they need to be making sure is in place at the institution. And so regulators and examiners obviously going to be primarily focused on the concept of safety and soundness. They're likely to be more focused on some areas of like your internal audit that may be focused on liquidity management, ALM, things that are more business decision related, whereas external auditors are focused on making sure that your financial statements are materially stated. And no matter what your business decision was that resulted in those financial results, the financial results are what they are. And so they're less likely to be focused on some of those more business strategy driven controls and processes. They're instead probably focused on some of the results you might see in your internal audit reports specific to those controls that impact financial reporting. So I think when you are developing your ongoing audit plans, it's just important to understand those different users, what it is that they're going to be focused on, and make sure that you're kind of checking the box with each of the different elements that they're going to want to glean from those various audits. And then on top of that, I guess those charged with governance section here, so senior management, the board, I would expect that they've got, they are interested in the results of all of your audits, right? This is the primary measure that they have to hold individuals accountable and really to fulfill their overall oversight responsibilities. So obviously critical to that party.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, especially in a year where you're contemplating a change to your audit plan, it's important to know that there's more than just the regulators. There might be other users of that sort of audit and risk process. So that's usually the place to start is if we make a change, who's going to get impacted?
All right, and the risk assessment process. So risk assessments are foundational to planning an effective risk management plan. These are really your documented roadmap to demonstrate the risks that you considered and how your evaluation of those risks ultimately result in the plan for your various audits. So again, here, some common themes, just an awareness of the number of different risk assessments. We've got a handful of them listed here on the slide, not necessarily an exhaustive list. Also, an awareness of the varying purposes and objectives of each of these risk assessments. So you probably have different teams that are completing maybe your audit as it relates to regulatory compliance, and a different team completing your audit as it relates to your internal audit and then your external audit team. Those varying risk assessments will drive sort of the specifics of the testing that they're doing with each of those different engagements. So it's important to, I guess, understand how that will impact the scoping that they have, the different concepts that they're covering, but also to make sure that at the end of the day, these risk assessments, they have a common thread, which is they all relate to your institution, the same risks that you are experiencing. So there should be consistency amongst the trends of the risk being discussed in there, and sort of the evolution of what that's going to drive in terms of the testing of these third parties. So I think a common theme as it relates to the risk assessments, as we discussed on the previous slides here.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's to the extent you're thinking about making a change, know that these risk assessments are technically the foundation on paper that drives that change. So if you have a plan to roll back an audit, let's make sure that's consistent with the risk assessments. And there are obviously more than one.
And I guess the only other thing I'll add on that risk assessment slide then, Josh, is we have this thought, and this goes back to the idea of don't just assume, same as last year, make sure you're thinking through and making adjustments to those risk assessments in your plans. But I think we fall into the common habit of sort of dedicating a particular time each year. This is when we're going to update our risk assessment, go through that process. And I think that's a fine process to have, but important to understand too that a risk assessment shouldn't be a static document. If you do have changes throughout the year, you do have new applications that you implement, whatever it may be, it is okay, and really you should be going back and adjusting those assessments and the resulting plans from those assessments.
That's a great point. So let's talk about maybe one of the bigger environmental changes that's impacting our industry, and that's the changes to Part 363. This time last year, we would have known that something was on the horizon, and we would have had proposed ruling on what those changes might look like with the asset thresholds. But we didn't know what that rule would be yet, and we didn't know the effective date that eventually came out. It was maybe right around the week of Thanksgiving last year. And so with that change in the rules, you got a change in the asset thresholds that sort of drive the different elements of Part 363. I think we're all pretty familiar with these now that we've been talking about them, but the top two items on this table, you can see the requirement around getting an audit and the requirement about getting an opinion on your internal controls. Those were at 500 and $1 billion. That has transitioned to $1 billion and $5 billion. And so we want to talk a little bit about what that means in terms of thinking through audit needs or audit relief. Other things changed, as you can see on this table, but by far, those top two were the most impactful, I think, to our institutions we worked with. All I'm showing on screen here is the direct excerpt from Part 363. And now if you're an institution with $1 billion in assets, but less than 5, this is the part of the standard that applies to you. And it basically outlines the requirement to get an annual audit and for management to acknowledge their responsibilities relative to the financial statements, rules and regulations, and obviously abiding with laws and safety and soundness. Again, another excerpt directly from Part 363. Now this is that second threshold. If you're above 5 billion, you see the same words on screen, but the additional words at the bottom there in red. That's the requirement that management has to have responsibility over the effectiveness of controls, and the requirement to get an opinion from an independent accountant on the effectiveness of those controls. So the stuff in the bottom there no longer required as part of those institutions who are in that first bucket, 1 to 5. So you're probably thinking, or have already thought about, like, how does this impact you? Where are you at in the sort of different asset threshold ranges? We did a survey last year among our clients. This was a webinar we did back in November before the final rule change was announced. And we asked folks, where do you think you're going to have the biggest impact coming off of this change in thresholds? And you can see on screen, many said not applicable at the top there. Some said, a very small percentage said, maybe the audit committee composition. Then you can see with C and B right there in orange and gold, we asked, is it going to be the impact you have with the relationship with your audit firm? Is it going to be the impact on how you deploy your sort of risk management program? Or, you can see in the bottom there, the most popular answer, second most popular answer, this is going to help impact growth and strategy. So I don't know, Elliot, any takeaways from that? Or I guess if you fast forward to today, do you think these percentages hold true?
Yeah, I guess as I reflect on these answers and think about where we are currently, maybe the one that sticks out to me the most would be B, impact our current approach to risk management. And I guess I'm thinking about this under the lens of the institution's approach to risk management, what they're identifying as risk, what they're identifying as their most important controls, not necessarily the relationship with the third-party service providers, but more so the institution's assessment of those risks. I think once we got into sort of planning this year with a number of our clients, they kind of came to the realization of this regulatory change, this change in thresholds, is more a matter of compliance and really didn't change the risk profile of our bank. It didn't change what we think is important in terms of control. So I would think that B would probably be a little lower percentage. Maybe it swings C up a little bit because the relationship with those third-party service providers and ultimately kind of the extra set of eyes on certain things. Maybe that piece wavered a little bit, differentiated a little bit from prior years. But I do think the large response here on A, the impact on the growth strategy, I think that held true. I think a lot of the discussions we've had with clients this year, very aware of those different threshold, fiducia thresholds, and the idea that crossing one of those thresholds, it has an obvious cost to the institution. There's the cost of for the third-party service providers, the cost of your employees' time to comply with those requirements. And so giving some relief there in terms of those thresholds, I think has made institutions a little more willing to accept growth strategies and not have to factor in those costs necessarily into that growth equation.
Yeah. Good question in the chat. Does this threshold apply is it the same threshold for holding companies? So the Part 363 is a bank-specific regulation. And I think the question's probably leading because we saw at the end of last year, like there was a little bit of a difference because you've got rules from the Fed, I think in particular around the audit requirement, that didn't change at the same time as the rules changed for the bank. So we got some questions about that at the end of last year. We understood that it felt like they were going to eventually converge. I don't know if I saw a final ruling on the Fed's audit requirement. We'll double check that. But that I know a lot of folks, and it was in particular in that, hey, now we're under $1 billion. we were previously over 500. Do we need to get an audit? And that's probably a good segue to this sort of next page here is like institutions. Let's talk about institutions in that range. You're less than 500, or maybe now you're in that bucket of 500 to $1 billion. How does this impact you? Well, provided we get some clarity from the Fed on the consistency and how they apply those, what it does is it gives you a little bit more cushion. If you were under 500 and you were close to the threshold, you were probably managing asset size, and you were probably being conscious of some of those rules for when you cross the threshold. I think without a doubt, now having the audit requirement go to $1 billion from 500, we've seen some institutions contemplate that as a change. Do we take advantage of that relief? And maybe if we'd been getting an audit before, maybe we don't do one now. I don't know that I've seen that one as common. I've seen some folks think about maybe do we transition to a director's exam? At the end of the day, that kind of goes back to that first slide. Who are the users of your financial statements? And in a lot of cases, we've got clients with boards or audit committees that have a risk tolerance that want to continue with an audit. So I didn't see a lot of clients in that bucket of less than $1 billion sort of fall off from doing an audit altogether. But we definitely had the conversation on a few. And then sort of the independence component of your audit firm is probably a piece you don't think about unless you cross that threshold. But if you cross the threshold from 500, you probably were surprised to learn that now you had to prepare your own financial statements, and your audit firm couldn't help with some of the consulting type of stuff that they would have done before. It's nice to have that threshold push a little bit, and now having had to have split some of those services, we've seen folks sort of take advantage of that piece as well. I don't know, Elliot, what do you think? Anything else you'd highlight with sort of the folks in that bucket?
I think just that piece you just mentioned about when you cross the 500 million, having to split up services, and specifically you mentioned the idea of having to prepare your own financial statements. I think that's one that seems like it's not burdensome, but that was one that a lot of clients were most happy to be able to kind of give that back to their audit firms to help them with the preparing, right? Your audit firm has software that formats your financial statements. It updates for tables with new standards and requirements coming out. So that's a piece where I think I've seen clients most, I'll say, proactive in switching that back to have the same provider do both the audit and financial statement prep. But outside of that, I guess the only other thing on that slide to mention is just in terms of internal audit, risk management planning. I think just a good point here of minimal changes, really, other than that flexibility as it relates to having to think about readiness for ICFR.
Yeah. So with respect to fiducia, I see the question in the chat there. I think it comes down to most people use that term fiducia. If you're talking about the requirements on internal controls, you're probably sitting in this bucket where you were previously over $1 billion. Now that threshold has moved to $5 billion. What are the implications to you? Well, the most obvious is before we had to have our audit firm give an opinion on controls. And so you're getting the relief from that opinion. And I would say almost all of my clients that were in that bucket, when they learned about this last year, took advantage of that relief immediately, if not for the upcoming year that we're in today. So that seems to be pretty predominant, that most folks are taking advantage of it. And of course, if you had done an opinion on controls, it's a lot of work. So we thought that one is a meaningful amount of relief. I guess a couple things I'd highlight there. While that relief and while that requirement goes away, I think it's interesting to acknowledge the fact that it doesn't change the dynamic or risk in the institution. It doesn't change the importance of internal controls. It just changes the requirement that you have to have someone give an opinion on their effectiveness. So a little bit of a subtle nuance that it doesn't mean we don't care about controls. It just means we don't have to go through the audit exercise of getting an opinion. And as you think about sort of risk in your institution, I've had a lot of clients continue with thinking about these key controls as kind of a common framework still. You've gone through the work before of identifying what are the key controls in your institution. In a lot of cases, those are still important controls that you want to make sure get tested throughout the year. So I've seen a lot of folks still continue to maintain an inventory of those controls while still getting the relief of not having the audit firm come in and issue the opinion. I don't know, what else would you sort of highlight for this group?
Yeah, I guess I would. So I clarify kind of your first statement there of our clients, whether it be last year or this year, largely taking that relief. That is, you're specifically talking about the external audit's opinion, right? That goes in your financial statements. The piece where we haven't seen as much change is, as you were alluding to, the internal audit plan. So what you're having your internal audit firms do from a control testing standpoint. There have been changes there, and it's just not the overhaul of let's completely forget about everything we did with this ICFR, identifying our key controls over financial reporting, kind of the framework we have there. It's let's not lose the pieces that we want to retain from there, but let's take the benefit of not having to stay so rigidly aligned with those requirements. And so I think the most obvious places to kind of take advantage of this, the most obvious place is the idea of sample sizes and having the coverage over the duration of the year. So before you might have had a phase 1 internal audit, a phase 2 internal audit, and then a roll forward period. You had to show some coverage over 4 quarters. A lot of clients have done away with the roll forward period and not as concerned with that coverage over the duration of the year. That's kind of an easier sort of thought as to how to be able to change the scope to take advantage of this. A little more maybe complex thought as to how you could scale and take advantage of this is really analyzing those identified key controls with the understanding that key controls, I don't really like the name key control because it suggests that these are the most important controls for your institution. They're the most important controls as they relate to one particular objective, which is the accuracy or the material accuracy or financial statements. So there are some more subjective kind of documentation type controls that maybe are kind of in the financial reporting area where you're analyzing subjective estimates on a periodic basis and you need the right documentation in place in order to check the box for compliance with FDIC. Whereas a lot of those thoughts are being performed anyway, and as long as those thoughts are in place, like the necessity and the specifics of the documentation maybe isn't as important. Whereas on the flip side of that, things that we've identified with the more transactional controls, the heavy volume, the loan originations and maintenance and deposit originations and maintenance, those controls are obviously very critical to both your operations and your financial reporting, and may even be something that your external auditors were taking some reliance for in the past and may continue to do that. So those are the kind of areas where we've seen institutions really kind of stay with the same kind of plan we've seen in prior years.
Yeah, I think if you looked at your audit plan today, you'd probably say, well, it feels like for some of the major cycles, things like loans and deposits and IT, those feel like similar coverage, and that's probably not a surprise. Audit firms in general, if they would have been doing an opinion on your controls before, they may still be relying on those controls as part of their audit process. So I think there's an opportunity from an external audit standpoint to get some relief as it relates to the exercise of getting an opinion. From an internal audit or from a risk management standpoint, I really think there's an opportunity to scale a little bit, but probably more refocus and have an opportunity to go deeper in some of the operational and business controls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no need to think that the two are tied to each other, that you have to go through with getting the opinion on ICFR if you go through all the mechanics of testing to that level during the year, they are two separate sort of decisions to make.
All right, we've bored you sufficiently on the audit topic around ICFR. Let's talk about what are some of the other trends we're seeing as it relates to kind of this theme of deregulation. Clearly, the change to Part 363 follows that trend, and that's meaningful. We've seen in large part some momentum just as it relates to all the sort of administration and kind of congressional momentum that direction as well. I'd say I'd highlight regulatory supervision in particular. I know interagency guidance came out this year, and in particular highlighted, what is an MRA, and also highlighted some interesting sort of changes that they might see in the future as it relates to exam cadence and exam scope. And I was curious to hear from a few of my clients that had exams in the last quarter. Did they feel different? And I can say from a couple, they would have agreed. They would have had in years past a report that was 50 or 60 pages, and I've seen a lot of reports that are less than 20 pages. So take that at face value. The other thing that I've seen is reports or exit agendas would have had a lot of written commentary that sort of bordered on an MRA, but was still a recommendation. A lot of that's fallen out of being put on paper. That's being discussed in an exit. So I think that's largely good from a standpoint of it reduces the amount of requirements. I think it's the only negative to that is if there are some things that are on the regulators' minds, it's harder to know what those are because they're not getting put down on paper. So those exit meetings are really important. But we have seen an actual tangible change in how sort of the supervision has been getting carried out. I'd also acknowledge, interagency policy, we're seeing more of these policies get updated with respect to moving away from prescriptive policy requirements and moving into more frameworks and principles-based policies. Model risk management, I know, is one that came out earlier this year. We've seen some additional things that are going to be on the docket with third-party risk management as well. So expect more of that change. But yeah, I'd say maybe the only other one I'll highlight on this page would be the community bank leverage ratio. Having the additional sort of change to that number go from 9 to 8 was really meaningful for a lot of institutions who previously may not have been taking advantage of that as one of the measurements for well capitalized.
I guess I'll also add on here, Josh, in the other observation. So I think positive for us on the call is the idea that in terms of new accounting standards, it's been relatively quiet this year. The SEC proposals, so I'm not sure how many SEC filers we have on the call today, but just a real high level thought here is that there is a proposal out that would result in a very similar impact to requirements for that opinion on ICFR as it relates to public filers. So it would pretty dramatically, at least the proposal as it stands, pretty dramatically increase those thresholds that would require your external auditor to opine on controls under SOX. Those thresholds are tied to public float as opposed to assets. And I forget the specific percentage that we heard, but it was at the thresholds that they're suggesting, it was a very large majority amount that would fall out of sort of that requirement.
Yeah, interesting to see, what'll happen with the public markets, but it's clear they want to promote sort of more equal playing field there, and some of your peers end up getting similar relief like you got with fiducia.
And whether a direct result of that proposal, or I'm sure that there's obviously other factors at play, but I would say the number of conversations we've had with clients this year just on that idea of going public has definitely increased. And the idea of these thresholds and the requirements, there's also some disclosure pieces kind of tied in there too. The idea of some relief there and a little lower cost to that decision has definitely has some institutions at least considering the option and weighing the pros and cons.
Yep. So, unlike the Part 363, which is pretty direct in how relation to sort of audit planning, what are these other trends we're seeing? How should that impact what you're doing this year or in the future as it relates to audit and risk management? It really depends. I think, it may help you think about your risk profile a little differently. It might give you some additional thoughts on how you tailor your risk assessment. I think the hard part with regulatory changes and shifts is you hear the term that it's a pendulum. Could the pendulum shift back? It's possible, probably not across the board on a lot of the stuff we're seeing. Our main takeaway is you just sort of proceed with caution. You take advantage of things that are available to you, I think, with respect to relief. But yeah, maintain sort of the awareness that the regulatory part is harder to assume will last consistently forever. So maybe with that, we can shift a little bit. We talked quite a bit about regulation in Part 363. Elliot, talk to us about technology trends.
All right. Well, I think if we continue to the next slide, I think we'll kick off this topic similar to the prior topic. And so with this, we had a similar question that we would have asked at our webinar last year about what technology trends are the individuals attending that webinar thought would have the most increased sort of focus in the upcoming year. And so we have listed on here, we've got IT system conversions and upgrades, heavier reliance on third parties. That's obviously a very important topic to regulators, the idea of third-party risk, cryptocurrency, stablecoin, and then we've got an overwhelming answer here on artificial intelligence. So what are your thoughts there, Josh, now that we've gotten into, 8 months of 2026 and kind of seen where these trends have gone? Do you think this holds true?
It holds true, and I would venture that line A would be even longer today. It feels like you can't go to a conference or have a board discussion that doesn't bring up the topic of AI. A through E, of course, are probably relevant for everybody, but it just feels like we're going to be talking about AI quite a bit in the next coming years. Whether or not you're using it directly, it's just going to be part of our industry. So yeah, this one, we could do a whole presentation on AI alone, but this is going to be a topic that I'm not surprised will continue to probably lead the interest in folks and where they think it's most impactful. So yeah, to sort of continue that thought, outside of AI, the things that we're seeing in terms of how institutions are seeing an additional use or reliance on technology, I think, the other areas are probably, if you talk about system changes, upgrades, new IT applications, a lot of folks are experiencing those changes because either their third parties are providing more enhanced solutions. Maybe, a lot of folks are thinking about new products and services, expanding digital sort of channels that exist. There's new, the payment rails topic is another one that obviously changes how we're maybe receiving real-time payments or using the FedNow, or even sort of the concept of stablecoin on blockchains. I'd say the other areas you see a lot of sort of technology reliance shifting, thinking about automation. How have we done things manually before? Now maybe things are being automated with processes and controls, or even just improved data analytics and integrating systems. The reliance on third parties, I think quite a few of those sort of should play or resonate, I would think, with most folks. So, in the context of the different things that are changing from a IT standpoint, or the different things that your institution might be relying on, how should that impact what you're doing from an IT planning standpoint? And again, if we talk about IT, we're probably talking about the idea that your institution already has some type of IT risk management function. in place today. And so how do those need to be sort of tailored or tweaked as you kind of have new technologies? Well, like we mentioned at the beginning, almost all this starts with the risk assessment process, and just sort of being aware of what's changing in your risk profile from a technology standpoint. I'd probably highlight the one in the middle of that page as it relates to just being careful that everything is going to get covered in an IT audit. Oftentimes you'll see the IT audit is going to cover things around your core. It's going to cover things around some of your network and some of your main applications. It doesn't always cover everything that might be in the scope of new applications, and the depth of that review can vary with respect to the different types of controls. So to the extent you have something new or something changed, I'd want to make sure that my IT audit's getting some coverage there as well, whether that's around different modules or different systems. Elliot, I don't know what else you'd highlight here with respect to sort of the IT planning process.
Yeah, I think just to branch off of what you were just discussing there with sort of the coverage of different applications and thinking through that piece of it and kind of tying it to, I think on the previous slide, we had that bullet point that was data analytics and essentially report writers. The idea of much more common now that we've got, and we have different applications for this too at Plant Moran, but these applications where they are established to pull data from your core or the different applications that we commonly think of as sort of holding the operational data or the typical kind of financial reporting data. We now have these other applications that the primary purpose is to take that data and put it into some other format that's easier for us to digest, whether for making decisions based on that information, or if it's reports that directly result in things that you're disclosing in your financial statements. This is an area that I think is commonly sort of overlooked in this scoping of your applications piece of it, that assessment. These are, we think of the source data applications as really being the components that we need to think of for controls, but there is also the risk of those reports and the information coming through those secondary sort of built on top report writer applications that they aren't producing the data that we need for their purpose. And so just being aware of that and the idea of change management is likely important with those, somebody's ability to change the reports and what you're seeing coming out of those other systems, user access. It's probably a limited scope of kind of the ITGCs that would be important to you in some of these secondary applications, but still definitely something to consider there.
Yeah. At the end of the day, appreciate the fact that IT, and the more you rely on it, the more it's a pervasive risk. So if you think about any deficiencies or findings that you have in IT, the more you've got an IT reliance, the more that's going to have a major impact, or I should say a pervasive impact on financial controls. If we would have asked our clients 5 years ago, do you rely on IT controls? They might have said yes in some instances. I think everyone's probably on the same page now that IT is just a pervasive part of risk, and it's a very important component of kind of how all of our processes and controls operate. Maybe another topic that's probably worth bringing up is just the idea of third-party audit and risk planning considerations. Again, if you think about AI in particular, where some institutions have said, hey, I do not have any involvement in AI whatsoever, little did they know, well, some of your third parties actually might be deploying the use of AI or other technologies. So by and large, whether directly or indirectly, what our third parties do ends up becoming a part of what we need to plan our risks around. And so in the concept of third-party risk, I think it's really important that you just maintain an ongoing inventory of who those primary third-party relationships are. I'm sure you do that already. You've got a vendor management program, but maybe just appreciate the nuance that you could have a really critical vendor to your bank and to your business, that maybe doesn't overlap to financial reporting as critically, or vice versa. You could have a really important financial application that doesn't rise to the quality of a critical vendor. And so all that means is when it comes to the audit sort of world and the audit planning space, having the coverage around those critical financial applications, whether that's required due diligence and SOC reporting, you want to make sure all that's getting covered. It might all be getting covered for your critical vendors, but then maybe these other key financial applications never got the vendor due diligence done. So we've seen a little bit of a mismatch there. And I'd say the takeaway is just thinking about that inventory. That's both critical to financial reporting as well as just critical to ongoing operations of the business as well.
Yeah, definitely agree there, Josh. And I think another important piece to just be aware of in that context of with those critical vendors, those that are more sort of critical for purposes of operation of the bank or susceptibility to confidential data, things like that. That's a different sort of consideration than those that are going to directly impact your financial reporting. And the SOC reports that you would receive from those third parties come in formats that are meant to cater towards one or the other of those risks, right? The SOC 1 reports are going to be specifically established for the purpose of reliance on controls that result in the financial reporting element of those applications. SOC 2 is not focused on the financial reporting piece of it, but more on the other risks associated with those applications. So just something to be aware of when you're going through the due diligence process and thinking about what sort of reporting that you need from another third party to feel good about what you're using that application for. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when your external auditors are coming in and taking a look at your applications, very likely that they're only concerned with those SOC 1 reports.
Yeah. Yeah, at the bottom here, I guess, you know, the use of models is another topic. We mentioned that deregulation concept, like the model risk management guidance did get a little bit less prescriptive. And so what are people thinking about as it relates to the scope and frequency of model validation? Maybe before it was just an inherent expectation that your asset liability model or your allowance for credit loss model are just going to be in scope every year. I think you have an opportunity to think about model risk and decide whether you know, a frequency less frequent than that is appropriate. Mostly, I'd say our institutions that do decide to deviate from an annual or a semi-annual are probably thinking about, hey, what's changed within the models that sort of is the rationale for driving another validation. So yeah, to the extent your models haven't changed year over year, maybe that's the opportunity to document in your model risk assessment the basis for, hey, this is the frequency of model validation that we plan to continue. So something to think about for sure with models. Again, yeah, this topic, again, it could be something we talk about quite a bit. And in fact, I know several have probably seen other webinars entirely dedicated to AI. Again, in the context of audit planning for this year, I think you just need to know what is the extent that AI is present in your organization. And that can be directly present through, you know, technologies that you're employing as a bank, or that can be present through the use of some of your third parties and some of the applications that they have that are being used at your institution. And so I think it's really important to know what those sort of what your exposure is. And I wouldn't assume that if we had no exposure on January 1, that's going to be the case today. I think it's really important to have an ongoing dialogue with the business units in your bank to understand these are dynamic things that they're developing and employing, and they may be adopting different uses of technology throughout the year. And so being in tune with that, we've seen a few of our institutions go through that where, hey, we don't think we have any exposure, but oh yeah, I forgot that we just launched this new application and the deposit operations group has already started using AI for scrubs. It's like knowing that stuff can change, and it's a pretty rapid development, as we all know and see today. I don't. The only other thing I'd mention is I don't think we're seeing AI yet being used in broadly as like core controls. It's not replacing, from what we've seen in banks, it's not replacing major key activities yet. In a lot of cases, those still operate as they did before. But you just got to be careful. AI is going to accelerate a process, and so a really reliable process may benefit, but an unreliable or clunky process that gets AI introduced, that can sort of accelerate the negative as well. So I think way more to come on this topic in the future. But if you're planning an audit or you're thinking about your risks, the biggest takeaway here is you just got to know what's your exposure across the organization, and know that exposure could change month to month or year over year for sure. Elliot, I don't know. Here's another interesting change that happened during the year or last year.
I think with this one, I think we'll keep it pretty high level, just an awareness thing. I think at this point in the year, most people on the call are probably aware of the change that came through and the retirement of the CAT tool. Really, there are a number of different frameworks out there. We've listed a handful of the more popular sort of frameworks that we see institutions using. There is still kind of the same requirements as it relates to cybersecurity, having to map your controls to show coverage over those cybersecurity concepts. It's just now we can't use CAT anymore as the basis for that framework, and can use any number of these other applicable frameworks. So I know we've got our IT specialists have helped a number of institutions, whether this year or at the end of last year, with sort of going through that mapping exercise to help show how their controls align with the other framework that they've selected.
Yeah, and if nothing else, you take a look at that picture of a cat in the sunset, and you remember, hey, the CAT tool is sunsetted. I saw a question there. The screens and slides will be made available, I believe, to the participants. So that and it's a good segue as well. That's the final slide we had as it relates to some of the content. I'd leave you with some closing takeaways that, with respect to audit planning, just be thoughtful. And this year, more than any year in the past, running the prior playbook or thinking about rerunning everything without any changes may not be the right answer, only because we've had so many unique changes this year that provide good opportunity for relief or just resetting on kind of your approach. So again, hopefully with some of the things we highlighted with Part 363 and thinking about technology, that's given you something to think about. But again, that these plans, your audit sort of design, like this is a dynamic process. So you may have put something in place at the beginning of the year and decided there is another risk we want to address. Like that's okay to sort of think through that stuff throughout the year. And so hopefully, again, we really appreciate the opportunity to meet with everybody and share some of these, but our goal is to just give you a few insights on things to think about for the year. I know we've seen a few questions come up as we've been going, but maybe I'll pause. We've got a couple minutes. Other questions from the group on any of the topics we've covered so far, or any of the other sort of related topics?
Now's your time to post questions in the chat, folks.
I'd offer as well, we will be more than happy to follow up directly with anybody one-on-one. So feel free to sort of reach out through David if you do have additional questions that come up, or if there's things you just want to have another conversation on, we're more than happy to assist there.
Yeah, we kind of covered things at sort of a high level concept basis. So if you have more specific kind of scenario type questions specific to you, happy to chat through those with you as well.
And part of the slides that'll be available will have Josh and Elliot's contact information on there as well. And as I tell people during our risk management advisory sessions with some of our customers, the regulators can roll back some regulations, and your auditor is maybe not asking for certain things, but keep in mind that at the end of the day, that no one cares as much about your customers as you do. So just because it may not be a regulatory concern, maybe it's not a audit concern, it may not be a concern that's in the books, but keep in mind that you should care about your customers more than anybody else. Thank you, Josh and Elliot, for joining us today. Hope you gained some really good knowledge that you can use back in your offices right away. And obviously, we'll be sharing this slideshow with everyone else at the end of this, as well as a copy of the recording. And make sure you take the survey. Your replies help us create a new webinar every quarter, and we kind of take the trends and run with that. But thank you, Josh and Elliot, both for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And everyone, have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.